Boulder shoulders. Shoulders so big they'll make Sisyphus weep. Here are the best shoulder exercises according to science. Welcome back, Milo Wolf here with you today, PhD in sports science with Wolf Coaching. Before we get into what the best exercises for shoulder growth are, let me give you a quick primer on anatomy of the shoulders. Generally, your shoulder musculature, or deltoid muscles, can be separated into three compartments. You can certainly separate them into more compartments, but really, who got time for that? For our purposes, the front delts, the side delts, and the rear delts will be perfectly adequate. Each of these components has different functions. Let's break them down. The front delt is responsible for shoulder abduction, flexion, transverse flexion, and internal rotation. For our purposes, for muscle growth, we'll be mostly concerned with shoulder abduction and flexion for the front delts. The side or lateral delts are mostly involved in shoulder flexion, like a front raise, shoulder abduction, or shoulder transverse abduction. For this video, we'll be mostly concerned with shoulder abduction and shoulder flexion. Finally, the rear delts or posterior delts are mostly responsible for shoulder extension, shoulder transverse extension, shoulder abduction, and shoulder external rotation. Since most of your back training already targets shoulder extension quite effectively, like a pullover, and external rotation work can often be limited by the strength of your rotator cuff muscles, in this video, we'll be mostly focusing on transverse abduction and transverse extension. Before we get into the specific exercises, let me give you a primer on good principles for exercise selection. What makes an exercise good for muscle growth? First, we want an exercise that's reasonably stable, or at least stable enough to enable the body to produce maximum levels of force. For example, squatting on a BOSU ball is not going to allow your glutes, quads, adductors, etc. to produce as much force as they could. A lot of the work in the movement would simply be down to stabilization as opposed to extending the knees or extending the hips. And in fact, there is research showing that in very unstable conditions, like squatting on a BOSU ball, force production is diminished. And so, while we don't necessarily need the most stable exercise ever, a reasonable degree of stability is beneficial. Next, the exercise we do for hypertrophy should target a specific function of the muscle we're trying to use. For example, in a lateral raise, we're targeting shoulder abduction, which is one of the functions of the side delts. Therefore, the lateral raise effectively targets the side delts. Next, we want the exercise we're performing to be limited by the muscle group we're trying to target. In this case, in the lateral raise, for example, we want to make sure that the side delts are going to be what limits our performance. We want to be ending the set, not when you're out of breath, not when you fail a rep due to instability or anything else. We want to end the set when your lateral delts simply cannot produce enough force anymore to overcome gravity. Next up, the exercise we use for hypertrophy should be lengthened friendly or stretched friendly. This is what I mean. There's three components. One, the movement should be challenging in that lengthened position. Compare a dumbbell lateral raise to a cable lateral raise. At the bottom of a dumbbell lateral raise, when your side delts are more lengthened, it's essentially too easy. Whereas with a cable lateral raise, even at the bottom of the rep, when your side delts are being stretched, you still have to produce a meaningful amount of force to get the lift to move. That's the first component. The second component is the actual position that you put your muscles into. For hypertrophy, we want to put the muscle groups we're trying to grow in a stretched position. Let me use the example of the side delt raise with dumbbells versus cables again. In a dumbbell side raise, you will not be stretching out the side delts very much. Whereas with a cable, you're able to get a deeper stretch by having your arm go in front of you or behind you versus a dumbbell lateral raise. The final component of being lengthened friendly is that it also allows you to do lengthened partials. Let's think about something like a barbell squat. Doing lengthened partials or just partial repetitions in that lengthened position is not going to be very feasible on a barbell squat versus something like a hack squat on a machine where you have safeties, or using a Smith machine or anything else. Using movements that are lengthened partial friendly will generally be beneficial for hypertrophy. As the final big component, we generally want to pick exercises that limit fatigue as much as possible. So, for example, when we get the choice between being seated and having back support versus being standing, where your glutes, your quads, your lower back, etc. have to stabilize the load more, we want to pick exercises that are seated. For example, a seated overhead press is going to be better for hypertrophy than a standing overhead press by some margin on account of being sat down and having more support and thus lower fatigue. It's not going to be a huge difference, but it is worth paying attention to. There are two bonus points for exercise selection. One is it time efficient? Certain modalities are going to be more time efficient than others. Think about this. If you're going to do a standing barbell overhead press, you would need to warm up by adding plates to the bar, calculating the increments, etc., etc. That does take time. Equally, you have to get a rack. Depending on your gym and how busy it is, getting a rack to do a standing barbell overhead press in might be relatively challenging. On the other hand, you have movements like the dumbbell overhead press or a machine overhead press, where loading the bar does not cost you any time because there is no bar. You just grab the dumbbells and get going. And so certain movements are going to be more time efficient than others. If you're someone with limited time to train, this can be a really important factor by which to pick your exercises besides just maximizing stimulus and minimizing fatigue involved. The final component, and interestingly enough, one on which barbells typically win, is micro loadability. How loadable and in how small of an increment is the movement? Let's go back to dumbbells and barbells. Dumbbells generally go up in increments of 5 pounds or 2.5 kilograms, which is relatively large. If you're trying to jump that on a overhead press, that can be quite challenging because at any given time you'd be adding 5 kilograms to both dumbbells combined or 10 pounds to both dumbbells combined. Meanwhile, on the barbell overhead press, you're able to micro load it more. You can get super small plates as little as 1 pound or 2 pounds, or equally, you can increase weight by as little as 5 pounds or 2.5 kilograms in most gyms on most barbells. So with all of those criteria in mind, let me give you my 3 picks for the best exercises for the front delts, for the side delts, and for the rear delts. First up, for the front delts, we have the seated dumbbell overhead press. Or you can use a barbell, or you can use a machine, or you can use a Smith machine. The key here is that all these exercises are stable enough for force production, they're very likely to be limited by front delt or tricep strength, and thus they're good choices for hypertrophy. Importantly, they're also relatively challenging in that lengthened or stretched position. If you perform an overhead press properly, making sure to get a full stretch and touching your clavicle on each rep, you'll find the movement is actually relatively challenging in that stretched position, which, as we discussed, is good for hypertrophy. This is as compared to something like a dumbbell front raise, where at the bottom in that stretch position, you have essentially no tension. So again, these movements win on that account. Additionally, the machine overhead press or the dumbbell overhead press or the Smith machine overhead press are all lengthened partial friendly, which means you can do lengthened partials and safely end the set after doing exclusively lengthened partials. If you're looking for a time efficient option, the dumbbell overhead press, ideally seated, or the machine overhead press are going to be great options. You don't need to load a bar, dumbbells are widely available typically, and with a machine, especially a stack loaded one, you essentially just put the pin in and you're ready to go. Here's a tip for the overhead press. Try to emphasize that lengthened position even more by controlling the eccentric most at the bottom, getting a pause and being explosive at the bottom, or by using lengthened partials. As an honorable mention for the front delts and muscle growth, I think the Bradford press doesn't get enough love. By design, the exercise is already a lengthened partial and thus is going to be quite effective for muscle growth. Ideally, do the Bradford press with a barbell while being seated. That's going to be a really solid option if you don't want to be doing an overhead press. Next up, the side delts. The best exercise for the side delts, according to the science, is going to be the cable lateral raise. Again, the movement is quite stable, and the most likely limiting factor is going to be the side delts. There are not a ton of other muscle groups that could be failing first. The front delts could be, perhaps the rear delts, but it's mainly going to be the side delts involved and to a lower extent, the upper traps. Additionally, the big way in which it wins over a dumbbell side raise is that you can actually modify the range of motion and make the lift most challenging in that lengthened position. In fact, here's what I want you to do. I want you to set up the cable at hand height when you start the rep. The cable should be horizontal. This way, the rep will be most challenging at the very bottom in that stretched, lengthened position and get easier and easier as you raise your arm. And not only will the lift be more challenging in the lengthened position than a dumbbell would be, but you also get to have a deeper stretch by going either in front of your body or behind your body and getting your arm across your body a little bit. As a time-efficient, honorable mention, try the machine lateral raise. Depending on what your machine is like, it may or may not be an equally effective option as the cable lateral raise. Some machines really do load that lengthened position more effectively than others, but either way, the machine is typically a more time-efficient option on account of being bilateral. You have to do half as many sets as you would do for a cable lateral raise, because for a cable lateral raise, you're typically going to be doing it single arm, which does extend the duration of that exercise a little bit. The one factor on which both cable lateral raises and machine lateral raises kind of fail is micro loadability. What I would recommend to circumvent the issue of having to jump 2.5 kilograms or 5 pounds on lateral raises is to simply use a double progression. Give yourself a rep range of, for example, 8 to 12 reps and use the same weight consistently. Once you reach 12 reps, increase the weight and then repeat the process. Increase reps up to the top end of that rep range, increase the weight. Repeat that process and that'll take care of a lot of the micro-loadability issues. And finally, according to the science, the best exercise for the rear delts is going to be the rear delt cable crossover. When you think about the rear delt cable crossover, it's essentially the exact opposite of what you would do during a chest crossover. Once again, on account of being bilateral, the exercise is stable enough for force production purposes. The movement is very likely going to be limited by the rear delt's ability to produce force, especially if you mostly stick to the motion of shoulder transverse abduction. There will be other muscles involved, muscles of the upper back, but that is going to be the nature of the rear delts and their function. Additionally, just like the cable lateral raise, the cable will allow you to get a deeper stretch and put more tension in that lengthened position versus, say, a bent over rear delt dumbbell fly. By taking a couple steps forward after unracking of the weight, you will make that lengthened position more challenging. Make sure you set up the cables at around shoulder height for this. This movement is also pretty lengthened partial friendly. In order to make it a lengthened partial, just start the rep as you usually would, but then stop the rep when you get to just this point, when your arms are directly in front of you. As two quick alternatives, try the high to low rear delt cable crossover, where you set up the cables a little bit above your shoulder height and go down a little bit in your motion, or the low to high cable rear delt crossover even. Just like for the cable lateral raise, this exercise isn't micro-loadable, so try using a double progression as well. As two honorable mentions, the best alternative is probably going to be the single arm cable face pull, wherein you rotate away from the cable in order to get a deep stretch by having your arm come across your body. Again, set up the cable at shoulder height. The second honorable mention in this case would be the machine rear delt fly. Although it doesn't have the same amount of stretch as a rear delt cable crossover, and the bottom position is typically quite easy in these machines, it does provide for a better resistance curve as opposed to something like a bent over rear delt dumbbell fly, and it doesn't give you the fatigue of being bent over like you would be during a bent over rear delt dumbbell fly. Here are some takeaways. For the front delts, try seated overhead press variations. For the side delts, try the cable lateral raise. For the rear delts, try the rear delt cable crossover. Generally, with any exercise, look for exercises that are specific, that are loadable, that are stable, that are limited by the muscles you're trying to target, that are lengthened friendly or lengthened bias friendly, and that minimize fatigue. That's the video. If you like the video, please comment, like, subscribe. If you want to see more videos in this style, where I take a body part and kind of break down what the best exercises might be, leave a comment down below and I'll make some more videos. And I'll see you guys, my subscribers, in that next one. Peace.